changing the world of work for women everywhere. We are Watermark. We're the only nonprofit women's leadership organization that spans all industries. We connect, develop, and advocate for the advancement of women in the workplace. The Watermark community includes senior executives, entrepreneurs, and emerging executives that support you not only at the top of your field, but also on your way up.
So tonight I want to tell you a little bit about what's this book all about, what prompted me to write it, who were some of the more interesting characters that end up in the book, and how did Melissa get in there? And what was the most memorable story that Melissa shared with me that got into the book? And then after that, Melissa will come forward and we'll continue the dialogue. So I should preface this by explaining that I instigated the career coverage at the Wall Street Journal, started our very first career column a number of years ago. I still write a career advice column. My latest column appeared in print yesterday. And I'm totally unqualified to be giving out career advice because I've only ever worked for one company, which is the Wall Street Journal. And I started my career with the Wall Street Journal here in San Francisco when I finished graduate school at Stanford. It was over 40 years ago, and when our daughter entered the workforce in the year 2008, I thought it was important that she understand what she was getting into, and that she should give credit to the women who came before her, whose shoulders she was going to be standing on. And as much as things had gotten better in the workforce from when I had joined in the 70s, that things were not yet, as I like to say in our house, hunky-dory. And if anything, she herself was going to have to work to make things better for women in the workforce, as women who came before me and as I and our generation had done. So in order to educate Abra, I wrote a first-person essay for a Wall Street Journal blog we then had called Journal Women. And the essay was called Remember the Barriers. And it was a look back at what were some of the issues I had dealt with as a woman entering the journalism profession in the 1970s. And what I talked about in that piece was coming to work for the Wall Street Journal in San Francisco, straight out of graduate school at Stanford, and some of the experiences I had, which were not ones that I had expected. I had worked on the Daily Northwestern at undergrad, where we were all equal opportunity slaves who just worked 24/7, men and women. And so on my first day at the newspaper, at the Wall Street Journal, I come into a bureau where they had never hired a woman before as a reporter, and there are 6 male reporters and a male bureau chief. And I found it a tad strange, but several of the men had pin-up calendars above their desks. And these were not things that you found on the internet. These were physical objects. And there was a nude woman for every month of the year. And this just, I was flabbergasted. It seemed so unprofessional. This is the Wall Street Journal. But what can I do? I'm green behind the ears. I'm straight out of graduate school at Stanford. I didn't think I could say anything, but I could do something about it. So I went out and I bought a calendar with male nudes. Put it up on my bulletin board, which again was a physical structure above my desk. We then had typewriters. Oh my God. And proceeded to try to do my job. My calendar lasted 24 hours, disappeared, never to be seen again. And then I saw what it was going to be like to work for the Wall Street Journal. I would get comments like, sources would, when they would meet me, say, where have they been keeping a dish like you? When I would go to cover corporate events at local business clubs in the Bay Area, I generally had to go in the back door where the kitchen staff came to work because they did not admit women. Sometimes I would take a male source out to lunch and he wouldn't want me to pay for it. And I'd say, oh, no, 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 it's not me. You know, this is Dow Jones, you know, the owners of the Wall Street Journal that are paying for this lunch. And you go, oh, okay. And then I'd say, and by the way, the two great nieces of the founder are the majority shareholders, after I handed over my American Express card. About a year after I joined the Wall Street Journal, story I wrote about the school superintendent in San Francisco who had lasted about a year or two. And it was a front page story about the fact that school superintendents in big cities have rather short tenures. It won honorable mention in the San Francisco Press Club annual press competition. And I was invited to the awards dinner. And all the guys in the office said, no, no, Joann, you have to boycott the event. I was like, well, why? And they said, well, because they don't admit women to the San Francisco Press Club. And I said, au contraire, mes frères, which in French means, I'm going. How else am I going to prove that women ought to be admitted to these private business clubs, to press clubs, to all these venues that were closed to us? So I went, and a few years later, at the press club in San Francisco and Washington and other places, lo and behold, began admitting women. I mean, women have been journalists in this country since before the Civil War. About 2 years after I joined the Wall Street Journal, my husband was admitted to graduate school, and we decided to leave the Bay Area. More about that later. And as my farewell gift, the guys in the office bought me an oversized card that folded out to here. It was the actor Burt Reynolds in his birthday suit. He had his hand over his private part, and the guys all wrote, "Good luck." Well, I got a huge amount of email reaction, as you can imagine, to remember the barriers. Even Abra, our 20-something daughter, emailed me a note. Interesting, Mom. But I heard from a lot of women from all walks of life and in various stages of their careers who had encountered far worse issues with their gender bias than I had, even as much as I felt I had been treated wrongly. And it made me wonder, since I was already writing about management issues and CEOs, and had met a handful of women in the course of doing both management coverage and career coverage, that maybe there was a book. Maybe there was a book to be done at looking at women who had gotten further in their corporate careers than I ever aspired or would get, who had also had career setbacks related to their gender and had become better leaders as a result. And as it turned out, the women who I ended up interviewing for the book, while indeed had those kinds of experiences, the kinds of setbacks they experienced were much broader than that. They had to do with not only their professional careers, but their personal lives. And on the professional side, it had to do with trying to be successful at what it is that they had chosen. Getting hired when they got out of school, getting that first promotion, dealing with the turn down for the next promotion or the first promotion, getting fired, and having to deal with men who didn't want to work for them because either they'd never worked for one before, or they'd worked for one and they knew they didn't like working for one. As it turned out, I interviewed 52 high-ranking corporate executive women, Melissa being one of them, and nearly 2/3 of these women are experienced public company CEOs. People like Mary Barra, General Motors, Ginny Rometty at IBM, Meg Whitman, now of HPE, Beth Mooney, who was, as of 6 years ago, the very first woman to be CEO of a major US financial institution, and today, 6 years later, remains the only woman CEO of a major financial institution. Irene Rosenfeld, who just recently announced is stepping down, retiring as CEO of Mondelez International. And I, of course, participated in our coverage of that development. And the sidebar I wrote was looking at, where have we come from in terms of women CEOs of Fortune 500. It was very distressing to not only see how few there had been, only a couple dozen, since the first one in 1972, which was Katharine Graham at the Washington Post. But I also inquired, in getting these figures from Catalyst, how many of these handful of several dozen Fortune 500 female CEOs had been succeeded by a woman. Because Irene is not being succeeded by a woman. Who thinks it's more than 10? Raise your hand. Oh. So we need to work on this, those of you who are female CEOs. The youngest woman I interviewed for the book is an entrepreneur in the Bay Area, a woman named Claire Shih. She is the co-founder, at the time it was begun, of a company called Hearsay Social. She started it with another founder in 2009 when she was 27. And she got on the board of Starbucks when she was all 29. How did that happen? More about that later, too. When I met her, she was 9 months pregnant with her first child. I went to her headquarters, your typical startup, you know, exposed air conditioning ducts and the whole works. And I said to her, well, so you're about to give birth to your first child? I hope you've got a good maternity leave policy. Funny you should ask that, Joann. She said, we didn't have one. But then I got pregnant and I formed a task force and now we have 4 months paid leave. And I said, great. This company, you co-founded it, it's your baby. How long do you think you'll be able to stay home? She's an entrepreneur. She wasn't sure. So that was a Friday, and the following Tuesday she gave birth to her son and came back 3 months later. So give her credit. The oldest woman I interviewed for the book would have never ever admitted her age to me, so I had to go to my favorite source of research, the internet. A woman named Charlotte Beers, who is a brash trailblazer in the advertising industry. She came to be known as the Queen of Madison Avenue, was the first female CEO of Ogilvy and Mather Worldwide, which is a major advertising agency. And I discovered that on the day I interviewed her, she was 79, almost 80. Did not look a day older than 50. Invited me to come interview her in her elegant Fifth Avenue apartment, which faced the Central Park. And when I walked into her apartment, I was amazed. All around the outside of the living room were peach-colored couches. The walls were done in bold red. And above me was an 18-foot-high ceiling done in gold leaf paper. Looks like a bordello, don't you think? She said. That was Charlotte. Melissa Dyrdahl and I came to know each other not because of the book, but because of a career column that I wrote. This column that I started for the Wall Street Journal. And it was a column about how women developed mentors both inside and outside a company. And so when it came time to try and find women to cooperate for the book, and I did reach out to more than 70, and chose 52, not one for every week of the year, but 52 said yes. Melissa was one of those. And I wanted to share with you what I thought, to my mind, was the most memorable story she told me that's in the book. What she did was turn tables on a bad boss and come out ahead. She found herself in the early 90s in this rather awkward position. She was then a 30-something senior manager for Claris Corp, which was a unit of Apple at the time. Her boss was moving on to a higher level job, and several of her male colleagues said, Melissa, you ought to apply for that. Because moving up to the director level was going to be a major promotion. But you know what? There were 6 areas that she would have to be responsible for. And she only knew 4 of them. And so what she said to me is, I decided all on my own that I was not qualified and I somehow was not going to be able to do a good job. She basically sabotaged herself. At that point, almost all the leadership in the company was men, And she said, I think subconsciously that's another reason why I was hesitant. So I didn't throw my hat in the ring. The guy who got the job came from Apple. He only knew 2 of the 6 areas required. He was boyish, he was handsome, he had a turned-up freckled nose, and he had big company experience, lots of charisma. But you know what? That wasn't enough. What a shock. And in fact, in 2 months after he got there, Melissa realized this guy was dumb as a rock. And this is what she said to me when I was sitting in Melissa's house. He doesn't work very hard. He shows up at 9, he leaves at 5. This guy has skated on his charm and his good looks. As she sees how bad a job this guy is doing, she suddenly realizes that, you know what? I can do this. And she said to herself, you can take what you know and still be a successful leader if you don't know everything. Guess what? That is absolutely true. And then after less than a year, this guy was gone. And then Melissa goes to a meeting with the vice president and says, I want the job. I can do it better than he can. And in fact, I can manage those functions I don't even know. And the vice president said, yeah, you're right. You can do the job. She gets promoted in 1992, and it becomes a crucial career milestone. She subsequently became an SVP at Adobe Systems, where her boss was the CEO. And by 2003, she's managing 250 staffers and a budget of over $100 million a year. With that, I would like to welcome my friend, Melissa Dyrdahl.
So what a pleasure for me to be sitting on the interviewer side of the equation. Joann is an amazing reporter and a tough interviewer, I have to tell you. And she got me to tell all kinds of stories I actually wasn't really prepared to tell. And after she left my house, I realized, I think everything I just said is going to be in a book that 1 million people are going to read.
I hope 1 million people read my book.
So I would encourage you to read it. It is one of my favorite books. I give it as a gift many times during the year. And I also speak, one of my dear friends, Nancy Bassani, is here, and she is a professor at San Jose State and teaches a leadership and organizational development class. And I'm on a CEO panel for her class frequently, and I always bring the book and talk about the book and have 3 or 4 copies to give away to students because I think it's such a great handbook for that it contains all kinds of practical advice. So, Joann, I have a few questions about just your experience writing the book. And you know, one of the things I know the answer to, but I was surprised, and I think everyone else will be interested in this. But did you just take time off from the Wall Street Journal and have a paid sabbatical to write this book and travel around and do all these wonderful speaking engagements?
I wish. I did ask for a paid book leave, and I was told that the journal didn't give paid book leaves very often, if at all. But my bureau chief was willing to negotiate what ended up actually being a better deal for me. He said that what I could do was spend 2 days a week for 6 months working on the book, continue to get paid as if I were at the office with one caveat, which is that I would be on call on those 2 days. And so if a big story broke, you know, if the CEO of Microsoft was stepping down, because I write a lot as a management reporter about CEOs coming and going, I had to drop what I was doing. And that actually worked out pretty well. And he continued as my bureau chief for about 9 months without saying that I had to stop. And at that point, I was about halfway through writing the book. And then my boss got a promotion, and I got a new boss. And I thought, you know, officially this is like done, but I'm not done. And so I'm not going to lie, but maybe I won't like tell the 100% of the story. So when the new boss comes in, I said, you know, I'm in the middle of writing the book. I'm pretty, you know, more than halfway done. And I've had this arrangement where 2 days a week I work from home writing the book. Before that I was reporting on. And I'm on call. You know, is it all right if I continue doing this till I'm done? I expect to be done by the end of the year. I never said it was offered to me as a 6-month deal that kind of kept going, because the prior boss never said, time up. And the new bureau chief, again, was just wonderful. And so I did finish the book on that arrangement. I later met a couple of colleagues who had gotten book leaves, and it turned out they were unpaid. And so they basically, and they were kept on health insurance, but they had to go off the payroll, and it was only for 3 months. Well, there's no way I could have reported and written the book in 3 months. So I think I got the better deal.
You did. And what about all the touring and speaking engagements that you've been able to do over the past year?
Well, what's the question?
Do you get, does the Wall Street Journal allow you to do that, and do you get reimbursed for your travel expenses?
No, we have a very strict conflict of interest policy at the Journal. And not only was it made clear to me that I would have to use my own vacation time or comp time, I would have to pay my own travel expenses, but the ethics czar has to approve all my speaking engagements. And initially he had to approve all my media interviews, and the poor guy was doing nothing but answer my emails. And he did veto one media interview with good reason, because it was to be with a woman who was one of the people who endorsed the book. He thought that was, frankly, I think that was more of a conflict of interest for her than for me, but it was fine. So I said, can I, now that I understand why you vetoed that, can I use my judgment on the media interview? Fine. But he still approves all of my speaking appearances. There was one speaking appearance that I was offered where I was sure he would not approve, and it was a French bank where I was going to speak at their New York headquarters, and often I'm asked to sign a release form if there's videotaping. And so they sent me what I thought was a mistake, an NDA. And I wrote back and I said, didn't you mean to send me your video, permission slip? You sent me an NDA. And they said, oh, well, yes, all suppliers who come to our offices must sign an NDA. I said, number one, I am not a supplier. I am doing this for free. And I can assure you that my ethics czar will not allow me to sign a non-disclosure agreement. Why would I have to do that if I am not a supplier? They said, well, you might overhear something in the halls. Well, duh, I'm a journalist. I want to overhear something. Any case, so I wrote them back saying, I'm sure the ethics czar would not allow this. And then I checked with the ethics czar, and he said, yeah, of course we want to know what you overhear in the halls of that French bank. So they emailed me back within an hour, and I didn't want to open up the message because I thought, okay, fine. Yeah. And the message back was, okay, no problem, we'll see you then. So they really wanted me.
That's great. So one of the things you mentioned in your opening remarks was that there were two women who stepped down from
Irene being one of them.
Yeah, Fortune 500 CEO ranks, which leaves us with under 6% of women leadership at the CEO level in the Fortune 500. Why do you think that is? And, I've heard, and I imagine you have too, and probably many people here have experienced that you get called to interview for either a CEO or a senior level role, and you can tell by the time you get done with the interview that you're just there to check off the box of we spoke to a woman. But you're not really a serious candidate. And the example that really stands out in my mind that's been in the news recently is with the CEO search for Uber. So, right, they're talking to Meg, and they need a female CEO, and all of their
they talked to a lot of other women too, though, Melissa.
Yes, exactly. But did they hire one?
No.
No. So,
but I also knew that Meg would go in there with the exact conditions she attached that she did, knowing Meg, having interviewed her for the book, that there is no way she would have accepted that job with Travis remaining on the board and with this litigation outstanding.
Right.
I mean, I think why the ranks of women at the CEO level have not gotten bigger faster is that it's a darn hard job, okay? And you kind of really want to do it. And frankly, there aren't a lot of men that want to do it either. It's just that women have started from a much smaller base, obviously, than men who have been CEOs forever and ever. But I am one of these people who looks at life as being the glass half full, not the glass half empty. And I am encouraged by the fact that we're seeing some strong increases in women at the senior level, but below the CEO. But it's not anywhere near what it needs to be. But at least it's getting to be double digits, and it's still single digits. I think the other issue is because that pipeline at the senior management level is still relatively small, you don't have very many women CEOs who are stepping down, who are turning over the reins to a woman, because there aren't a lot of women to choose from. Anne Mulcahy, who's one of the other CEOs that I interviewed for the book, when she stepped down as CEO of Xerox, did hand the mantle to a woman. But when her successor stepped down, her successor was a guy. And so it's a numbers game, it really is. And women still are heavily populated in the middle management ranks, and the funneling gets very, very narrow very quickly in senior management. And we're not going to have a significant number of women as CEOs until women in middle management are getting a boost in terms of those women who are in senior management, not only serving as role models, but as active role models. Sorry to give such a long speech.
No, it was great, and I agree with you. And what do you think, you know, in the past, I would say, you know, sort of during our generation, when there were very few women in senior roles, my personal experience was those women did nothing to help my career. I had, the mentors I had and the help that I got was men. And I think
and how about when you got in senior management? How much did you do mentoring of junior women?
I put a lot of time and effort into it, and anybody who worked with me at Adobe knows that I spent a lot of time mentoring. I mentored internally and for an external organization, and I still mentor women and men. But I specifically made that a priority when I was at Adobe because I felt like I wanted to give back. I didn't feel like I really got it from the women who were ahead of me and who were a little bit older and more senior than I was during the early parts of my career. But I was also shocked during those early years that they seemed so indifferent to building a pipeline of women and providing that level of support. Do you see that in other industries? Because I can only speak from tech. My whole career was in tech.
I get often asked this question, and unfortunately I have a very narrow frame of reference. And that is the women who chose to cooperate with me on this book are not just women who earned it, but women who chose to return it. And they're women like Melissa. And often they're women who either had no female role models earlier in their careers or couldn't get support from those women for one reason or another. And it's generally not done out of deliberate oversight. It's done out of inexperience. And there's this great story in the book involving Sandy Peterson, who's the highest ranking woman now at Johnson & Johnson. Early in her career, she goes to work for McKinsey, the big management consultancy. And she, at that point, is the mother of a toddler and figures they will never hire her if she admits that she's a working mom. Because management consultants, as we all know, travel all the time, Sunday night to Thursday night. And so she doesn't bring it up, and nobody asks, and she gets hired. And she joins an office where there are a number of women who are management consultants, and she's so relieved because she will get support. And she doesn't get any support from these women. And it's not out of spite or because these women felt that they did it themselves and she should have to go through the same school of hard knocks. It's because none of the women there were mothers. None of them had children. And so when she asked for guidance on how do you make this work, she got nowhere. And fast forward, much further in her career, when she joins J&J, coming from a European company where she'd spent only about a year or so after staying home for over a year to care for her dying husband, she decides that the advancement and mentorship and sponsorship of women is going to be her personal priority. And you'll see this quote from her in the book when I said to her, you know, why is this so important? And she says, because, you know, by the time I'm done here, you know, we're going to see a significant, if not half, of the women in senior leadership, of the people in senior leadership being women. And I said, really? So when are you going to be done here? She says, I don't know, you know, it's a work in progress. So she holds every member of her team personally responsible for identifying and coaching high potential women, making sure they get challenging assignments, and then she tells these direct reports that they in turn have to hold their direct reports. What was interesting is, as part of my talking about the book, I was invited to speak at a J&J Global Women's Conference in June, and then I got invited to come to a local site of J&J just a few weeks ago. And I asked some of the women I met at both of these events, you know, Sandy Peterson sets this wonderful role model, as does your CEO, gender, you know, diversity and advancement of women. It's a very important, you know, issue, obviously, for people at the top. How does that percolate down to the grassroots, to the people, you know, here in the operating units? And it was interesting the answer I got, which is it all depends on what part of the company you work in. If you're in HR, yeah. If you're in tech, if you're in this little startup unit, so-so. And they were explaining how both by geography as well as, and of course there are all kinds of different business units, as well as functional areas, the level of commitment and understanding as well as unconscious bias is going to vary depending on where it is you work. I thought that was really interesting. Which gets back to the question of if the model of how we want to operate a company is being set by the leaders at the top, how do we make sure that communication gets down? And I believe that's probably part of what Watermark's mission is about.
So let's talk about sexual harassment for a second. If you're our age, Joann, you did not ever not experience sexual harassment at work. It was a given. It happened all the time. It was excused. It was tolerated. You were made to feel it was your fault. That was just sort of the norm in the 80s and early 90s. And then slowly it started to change, and it became there were classes about how to detect and respond to sexual harassment, and companies got put more effort into that. But I notice now that the younger generation of women seem to be more willing to publicly call it out. So
it's even got a name. It's called the Ellen Powell effect.
Yes. You know, the woman who was the engineer at Uber who wrote the document about that. Taylor Swift did not hesitate to make a case about the man who grabbed her at the award show. So,
and Fox News, how can we forget that?
So what are you seeing as far as the change that's happened over the last 30 years and how sexual harassment is viewed and discussed?
Well, it doesn't ever cease to boggle my mind every day for the last year and a half to see stories again and again, and it's not just in the tech arena, of what women have had to go through and are still going through today. But I am very cheered by the fact that women are coming forward, and as they come forward, they're finding safety in numbers, and they're finding that it does not have to be the career killer that it used to be outspoken. And it's been incredible to see some of these men in the tech industry in this part of the world who have been identified and then are, particularly the venture capitalists, who are then like doing these public mea culpas to the women who have been victimized by them, to want to somehow be forgiven? I don't know, it just strikes me a bit odd. But again, back to the returning theme of my book, a number of these women were victims of sexual harassment early in their careers and vowed that if they ever got into positions of power, they not only would not tolerate it, but they would set a higher standard than whatever their company was doing. And so there's this great story involving a woman who had been sexually harassed in her 20s, who then gets to be a senior level executive, or what was then called Sears Roebuck, and is confronted one day by two young buyers, a pair of women in their 20s, who are complaining about one of her senior male executives having used what they considered vulgar remarks towards them. And they're crying, and she makes them sit down and asks what happened. Well, it was a product planning meeting in which they were talking about the launch of a new line of women's underpants. And this male senior executive says to these two 20-something women, "I'd really like to see you in those panties." They didn't find that amusing, and neither did she. And so she realized that the Sears official policy did not apply to language, inappropriate language around women. It applied to acts. And she calls him into her office and explains, in my book, this is sexual harassment. And she fired him. And then she summoned the two young women back to her office at the end of the day. And they were absolutely, totally surprised. Because this woman was one of the very few women in senior management. Everyone else were men. And they also knew that the policy didn't go that far.
So one of the topics that you devote a chapter to in your book is executive presence. And as you say, you have to act the part and look the part. But one of the things I notice here in Silicon Valley...
And do the part.
And do the part. Yes, of course, you have to be able to do it. That was my assumption.
I'm just teasing.
But in Silicon Valley, we have such a casual culture. And what I've personally seen is many younger women who I feel are really doing themselves a disservice by dressing in a very, very casual way, in a way that does not lend credibility and professionalism and this more serious tone to ensure what is brilliantly coming into their minds and out of their mouths. So do you notice that more here in Silicon Valley, or is this an issue that's prevalent around the country?
No, I think that is pretty unique to the West Coast culture. And I'm curious, when you see women dressed like that, do you keep your mouth shut, or do you volunteer advice? And what kind of reaction do you get?
Yeah, so I have volunteered advice. Sometimes it's appreciated and accepted, and really is it was more naivete on their part. In other cases, women are like, I don't know, why should that matter? What difference does it make how I look? It really should be about how well I do the job. And it's hard to argue with that to a certain extent. So
what do you say then?
Well, what I say, because it's what I believed and it's what made me, do you see what I mean about her in the interview? I'm just realizing how right? But what I realized is that what I learned in my career was, if you want to be taken seriously and if you want to have a CEO job, people need to be able to envision you as a CEO. And so that's what I say. However, I was coming up through my career during a different period of time when there wasn't the level of casualness that there is now, and where there were so few women, and so we were so concerned about being perceived as being professional that we almost dressed like men. So, we were back at the early ages of, wear a bow tie around your neck and a skirt down to here, because then your gender is completely invisible. So on one hand, I love how far women have come, but on the other hand, I think we all have to be careful about where is that pendulum and what works. Obviously for you, it's important to be authentic, but you also need to think that what you look like is what you're presenting to the world.
Exactly. And there's this great story in the book involving Penny Hersher, who is a veteran of the tech industry, who, as part of her returning it, does a lot of coaching of would-be entrepreneurs. And this, again, 20-something comes to her office and is wearing not a t-shirt and jeans, but not much fancier than that. And she says to her, I know this is how all the guys, where you work now dress, but if you want to be taken seriously, you already have one strike against you, so to speak, as a woman. You got to look the part. And she said, look at every picture you can find of Sheryl Sandberg. You will notice she is always wearing a monochromatic dress. And when she said this, I had to go home and look up it's a monochromatic dress. And it means a single colored dress. And the young woman sort of listened very kindly, but didn't seem to react at all to what Penny was saying. And then came back a few weeks later to update her on how she was doing with getting her business going and raising money, because that's what she came to get advice about. But she came back wearing money.
Okay, so we just have 1 minute left, so I've got one last question.
Talk fast!
Okay, and then we're going to take questions from all of you. But my last question is, are we moving forward? Are we hopeful for the future?
I am, as I said, a half-full glass person, and I am hopeful that we are moving forward. I was not hopeful after the election, but I got an email from our son the next morning. I was actually out here in California doing book talks right after the book came out late last year, and I got an email from my son, and he said, you know what? The outcome of the election will sell more books. And he's right. That's why I'm hopeful, okay? As much as women have not advanced at the rate I expected by this time in my lifetime, we are making progress. But for every setback, I think it makes men and women who believe that having women be successful is important work all that much harder.
Exactly. Very good. Thank you all very much.
Glenn and I will be taking some questions for Joann and Melissa. Yeah.
So first off, thank you so much for coming today. You've mentioned unconscious bias a few times, and I just wanted to hear your thoughts on what should we be thinking today about the biggest unconscious biases that we should be working against in today's workplace.
You go first.
Okay. Well, I think the biggest unconscious bias issue we should be dealing with is the expectations that we may have and assumptions about both what we think as women we're capable of doing, as well as assumptions that men and women have about what other women are capable of doing. For some reporting I'm doing for an annual section the journal does on women in the workplace, I read about a recent study in which they looked at what percentage of men and what percentage of women want to take international assignments as part of their career development. And it's roughly equal. And then the same study said, but a far higher percentage of men actually get those international assignments than women. Now, why is that? Is that because women are not raising their hands? Possibly. Or is it because there's this unconscious bias? She's got a husband, she's got young kids, she's probably not going to want to take an international transfer. And we have to get past these unconscious biases to open up our minds to other ways of thinking. And I talk a lot about the importance of companies mandating unconscious bias training in the book, because there are several in the Bay Area that do so. But as I've spoken about the book around the country, and often on college campuses, I've come to realize that by the time you get in the workforce, it's a little too late to be getting unconscious bias training. And so, again, I've been very encouraged by the fact several campuses where I have visited are either making it mandatory or offering a voluntary unconscious bias training, even at the undergraduate level, which is where it needs to happen. Now you get to answer that question.
Yeah, I don't have anything to add. That was great. Go ahead.
No, actually, I want to add something. I think a lot of it is because, you're talking about some of them don't want to leave their husbands. But a lot of times, the husbands make so much more money than their wives. that it doesn't justify for the whole family to move, to be displaced to internationally. So I think that's
That's certainly been a
Yeah.
factor in.
factor part of it.
So, song, did you flip it on? So I probably don't need it, but.
No, it's all right.
Okay. I can tone the mic. Well, first of all, thank you so much for, a great interaction. And I can relate to a lot of the stories that you shared. I kind of lived through that, right? Like, first female executive, look around, old male, mentor, yes, finally I find a woman. She has a stay-at-home husband, who take care of the kids, or never had kids. And I'm thinking, I can't relate, I have kids. But anyway, so I can totally relate. But one of the things I'm finding recently is when I'm talking to the younger generation, because I'm all about mentoring, and I have a lot of mentors within the company, outside, etc. One of the things that I'm finding is that they are becoming, in a way, smarter than the way I was, which is constantly thinking about how do you break the barriers and get ahead. They're stepping back and saying, you know what? I think there's more to life than just work. I want to have kids. I want to travel. So I feel the next generation, the values are changing. In some ways, I said, great, you're more balanced. But do you see that change with the people you talk to or in your corporation? I'm just curious.
Well, I've spoken at several dozen companies over the last 9-10 months, and these women that I'm meeting all, for the most part, seem pretty committed to their careers, I guess because they're coming to the event to hear about the book. So again, it's a narrow sample of the universe. But I also think even while I was going through my career, I met women who sometimes dialed back, stepped off the work track, stayed home for a couple years, came back. Some of the women I interviewed for the book worked part-time, or in some cases, like in Sandy Peterson's case, stayed home for over a year with her husband, who was very ill. And at one point, after she'd been home with him for over a year, she was asked to interview for a job with Bayer AG, where a big healthcare company in Europe. And she didn't want to go for the interview because she felt very important to her to be caring for her ailing husband. And he said to her, Sandy, if I beat this and I recover, you're going to get kind of bored staying home with a 16-year-old, right? They have one child. And if I don't make it, you're going to need to go back to work and support our son. So I think you ought to take the interview. So she did, and accepted the job a few weeks after he died that spring. And went to work for Bayer for not very long, and then came to J&J. But because of that, in addition to becoming very committed to increasing the status of women, she's also very sensitive to the fact that sometimes people have to pull back and step back from work because their personal life intrudes. And there's this great quote from Sandy in the book when she sees one of her staffers dealing with a family crisis. She says, go home, take all the time you need. I don't care how long it takes. You come back, when you can. Your job will still be here. Because she lived through this herself. And that is, again, one of the more amazing things about these women that I met for this book. So many of them had personal crises, either a very ill husband or a husband who died, or they battled breast cancer. I don't know how many of you know Carol Bartz, another woman that I interviewed for the book, who, a month after she is made CEO for the first time, is diagnosed with breast cancer. And she tells this really disheartening story in the book where she decides to hold a news conference, her very first one as CEO of a public tech company, where she is letting the world know at a tech industry conference that she has breast cancer. And so she says, at this news conference, I will be going into the hospital for surgery tomorrow. Are there any questions, she asked the assorted member of my esteemed profession. One young man raises his hand. What do people think was his question? Shout it out.
Is there anything we can do for you?
Okay, another idea.
Who will take over?
Which would be a logical question. Who will step in while you're... No, his question was, which breast?
Oh my, no way.
Yes. Now, those of you who know Carol Barth know she does not get scores, right?
No, she doesn't.
So I was dying to know, oh my God, what was your,
Brilliant comeback.
brilliant comeback, right? And this is not in the book because it's not, very nicely worded, but I said, did you ask him if he had, cancer of the... Because that would have been a Carol Bart's kind of response. And she said, no, Joann, I was just like so flabbergasted. I said, next question.
Speaking of which, we've got one right.
So back to thank you for everything, this is really wonderful, but back to the training back in college about the unconscious bias thing, kind of speaks to the announcement that was just announced today with Secretary of Education Betsy DeVos changing the rules around sexual assault.
I'm
I don't
sorry,
know
I
if you
didn't
heard-
see that.
you didn't-
I'm
okay.
busy promoting the book. What did she say?
She is basically making it harder for women to, press charges, against, making it harder for victims of sexual assault, essentially,
In colleges or in any of
in
those?
colleges. So I just was wondering if you had heard about that and had anything to comment on it, because it just feels like we just went back, we just regressed decades.
Right, but look at whose mouth it came out. I think it's going to invite a lot of litigation. That would be my initial reaction.
Yeah, she was saying that the laws are too hard on those, not the laws, but those being accused of the assault. Colleges are being too tough on those, the perps, the suspected.
Anyway, another question over here.
And what happens when her daughter is sexually assaulted her freshman year of college? Do you think she will change her tune?
No.
I don't even know if the woman has a daughter.
Between the Carol Barts and that, any comments on Fox News and the cascading cultural collapse of a world that was built upon female discrimination, combined with the election? It seems to maybe women of our age that the intensity and the bald-faced discrimination has accelerated in the past year or two, and or maybe it's just more exposed. And I'm curious about your thoughts, sort of the shift in the zeitgeist here. Maybe we were more polite 3 or 4 years ago, and now we're dealing with reality.
Well, I also think there have been a fair number of heads that have rolled at Fox because of the sexual harassment and abuse scandal there. So there is a small modicum of justice in the world. And by the same token, as I was saying, the outcome of the election, I think, has mobilized, and is one of the reasons Paradigm for Parity has gotten so many CEOs to sign up, because people are trying to, in their own small way, make things better. Because frankly, there are many, many studies that suggest the more women you get into senior management, the more women you get on corporate boards, the better shareholders do. And I did an event yesterday at McKesson, and this was one of the questions that one of the women at their headquarters asked. She's like, so there have been all these studies, why don't the men believe the results of the study and therefore support women's advancement? And I said, because men see it as a woman's issue, they don't see it as a men's issue. And if anything, they feel, some of them feel threatened by this. I did a presentation for the Women's Network at Dow Jones, which owns the Wall Street Journal, and one of my dearest colleagues at the paper, her question was, her husband had been laid off by the New York Daily News. He had tried repeatedly to get hired by the Wall Street Journal. He had done a lot of freelancing. They knew him, they respected him, and they told him that, each opening he raised his hand for was going to either a person of color or a woman. And so her question was, is the advancement of women coming at the price of the advancement of white men? Which I thought was an interesting question. And so, I can't remember exactly what I said to her, but the answer I gave to the McKesson woman was, it's got to be a game in which we all benefit or no one's going to benefit. And so when Doug Conant, who is the former CEO of Campbell's Soup, has this enlightenment and decides to become a much more aggressive proponent of women's advancement, he suddenly goes from having 1 or 2 women on his immediate reports team to multiple women, and the guys on his team are feeling threatened. Big surprise. Because he's got diversity as an agenda item every week on his staff meeting with his senior team. And so I quote him in the book as saying a couple of his male direct reports say, is there going to be any room left for me at Campbell's Soup? You're promoting, you're hiring women. He'd hired Denise Morrison, who ends up succeeding him. After over 100 years, the company that sells overwhelmingly to women is run by a woman. And Doug's answer to the men is, the women who are being promoted and the women who are being hired are going to be judged on their performance, as will you. And if you don't like it, you probably should look around. And a couple of the guys quit. And at the end of the day, men need to believe that to the extent that women are successful, it's good for their careers too. And men have to be working on this as diligently as well.
Joann, thank you very much.
Oh, sorry.
That's okay. When I came to Silicon Valley almost 30 years ago, there were not a lot of women in technology. In fact, Carol Barks was one of the few when I was at Sun Microsystems. And I thought, okay, this is going to get better. And we fast forward to 2017, and we haven't talked about the infamous Google memo about women should be in engineering. So it seems that things have certainly not gotten better. In some ways, we've regressed. What are we doing wrong? What do we need to do to change that in the future? I see my daughter, who's in her early 20s, having the same issues that I had at that age, and we should have learned and we haven't.
And is she in tech as well?
She's in production in Hollywood, which is 90% male. It's almost worse than tech.
And what advice do you give her?
I told her to take advantage of the fact that she's often the only female in the room, because that makes her stand out, and to have male allies so that when someone ignores her, that to basically get them to say, oh, did you hear what she said?
Exactly.
And do that.
And there actually are a couple of women I interviewed for the book who deliberately took that approach because they got tired of being ignored or belittled or not being given credit for what they had brought up in a meeting. And so if they knew there were going to be at least one other woman going into the meeting, the 2 women would make a pact and agree that when, if this did happen, a male participant stole their credit later in the meeting, the colleague would say, John, I'm so glad you endorsed what Sally said at the outset of the meeting. And I think you're giving your daughter the exact good advice. If she is the only woman in the room, she needs to have allies going into that situation. There was this great story in the book involving Diane Bryant, who at one point in her career at Intel, and she ends up being the highest ranking woman at Intel, is told by her boss that she cannot call on a client company because they won't deal with a woman, okay? And she can't believe this, you know. She knows everything that this client needs to know about the product line. And when the meeting is over, one of her peers, who happened to have been in that meeting with her boss, takes her aside and said, that's not fair. I'm gonna basically go behind the boss's back and make it possible for you to go visit that client. And again, I'm not going to tell all the good stories, but there's this great story when she then goes to Texas to meet the client.
So what are we doing wrong in Silicon Valley?
All right, so what are we doing wrong in Silicon Valley? How about you answer that question?
I didn't write the book.
No, but my book is not all about Silicon Valley. You know Silicon Valley a lot better than I do.
I think in Silicon Valley the challenge is still that women are a minority. And I think that it's, there are often 1 or 2 women in the room, and it's 90% men. And I think there are still a lot of women who don't support other women. There's a special place in hell for those women, as far as I'm concerned, but it happens. And I think some of it is unconscious, and it's self-preservation, because you're trying so hard to survive and survive, let alone thrive, in an environment where you're not taken seriously, you're dismissed, you're ignored, everyone walks out of the room and goes into the men's room and makes a decision and comes back and informs you. I can't tell you how many times I had that happen. So,
and then what did you do?
I just looked at him like, well, I couldn't really participate in that, could I? If y'all are going to go talk in the men's room while you're all standing around the urinal, what am I supposed to do? They didn't realize they were doing it.
Yeah, so what did they say?
They said, oh, sorry.
And then did they stop doing that?
One or two men became aware that that was happening, and so they would say, we're going to stop this conversation until after the bathroom break. But those guys are few and far between. I don't really want to bash men, because I've had some great men mentors, and there are men that are actively trying to support women and move this issue forward. But I think
and that's the key to your question.
Yeah.
Okay? Men need to be educated, and they need to be educated about their elite status, especially white guys, that they are part of a privileged class that is one that excludes people of color and excludes women in ways that they probably do not recognize.
Like when they all go to the men's room.
Like when they all go to the men's room. So I wrote a story a couple of years ago about corporate boards where a majority of the members were women. And the lead example was about Avon, where once women dominated the board, they ended up having the board meeting in a room where the ladies' room was right outside the door, and the men had to go down the hall, past the elevator on the other side of the building. So it all kind of depends on who's got the balance of power. And so while women remain in the minority, whether it's at lower levels, middle levels, or upper levels, you have to have alliances with men. You really do. And so I think your advice is spot on for your daughter. Apropos to our daughter, she ends up going into a field that's heavily dominated by women. She works for an organizational consulting firm that is a for-profit company with a social mission, and I think it's like 85% female. And so, I don't even, has she finished reading the book yet? This is my husband. She can't really identify with a lot of what I share in the book because she hasn't experienced it. Good for her.
So I have a question from Melissa.
Hi.
Here. So you mentioned that you're very active in coaching women in your company around and outside of your company as well. And we talked about the clothing issue. But in addition to that, I would be curious, what advice would you give us, and given all of what was just discussed, especially if someone, and we talked about some women not even wanting to get up to the C-suite, but if you have those young aspiring women who do, what advice do you give them?
A lot of it is situational. So I will give you a couple of broad kind of general statements. But a lot of the mentoring I do is really women talking about a particular situation that they are challenged by in their organization. But a couple of things I'll say in general is women tend to apologize way too much. Mm-hmm. So you rarely hear a man start a sentence that says, "I'm sorry, but." Start listening. You can count the number of times in a week on one hand that you might hear that. Secondly, we ask if we can ask a question. Instead of just asking a question, I did this all the time. I would say, "Can I ask a question? Like, why do I need somebody's permission to ask a freaking question?" So there's, I think these are verbal tics that we have and ways of communicating that we have learned in our cultures that don't work for it. They don't serve us in the business world. I also think women often don't pay attention to their body language, and Carol Bartz tells a great story about this in the book, which I won't tell because you need to buy the book and read it. And
I'll be autographing when we're done.
And I tell a story about it as well, which I also won't share, about one of my tips for dealing with it. But just in general, I will tell you, men love to take up space. That's what they do. They sit with their legs like this, and they put their arms out like this in meetings, and they put their feet up on the desk, and that's just a manly, masculine, male thing. Rarely do women do that. I'm not saying you should, but there is a message that gets conveyed by your body language, and I think we often, unless someone points it out to us, we're not even aware that we're not sending strong confidence signals. We're sending kind of weak and submissive signals.
I would also urge, if you don't have something like this at the company where you work, I would also urge you suggest that the company create a shadowing program. I wrote about this in our Women in the Workplace special section last year. And the idea of a shadowing program is that a lower level, high potential woman gets assigned to a senior level guy or a senior level woman for not a huge long period of time, maybe a couple days. But they get totally immersed in what that role entails, as well as understand what is the proper way to conduct yourself in a meeting of really high-level people. And what are some of the shortcuts that make it possible for some of these senior-level people to get so much done in, what's a long day, but it's not endless. Believe it or not, you can get to senior management and still have a life, which seems hard to believe.
You all, I am so sorry we are out of time for questions, but Joann, as you know, we have books for sale, and she'll be answering questions as you get your book signed. So let's give a warm thank you to you both for